Good morning. It is a Monday of Mondays, and I want to talk about some of the things that are going on today, some of the trends that have been happening, and let's get a little bit weird with it because I'm excited. So, a lot of news flow towards the back end of last week through the weekend. It's kind of tapered off. I think people are getting ready and recovering for Monday morning, and here's what we've seen so far today. And this is, of course, Monday, the 24th of March, 2000. Off the top of it, markets are up across the board today. Over the weekend, President Trump on social media, I believe on his Truth Social, made a comment stating to the effect that the reciprocal tariffs that are planned to go into effect on April 2nd are going to be scaled back to a degree. Obviously, his critics will say, well, look, this is Trump flip-flopping. And I'm not going to be an apologist for his trade strategy or for any of his policies, but it certainly does seem that it's most likely more of a negotiated thing where countries are realizing that instead of facing a major disruption with the imposition of tariffs, they'd like to just get ahead of it, make a deal, make an arrangement. There was a famous, I believe it was Otto von Bismarck said it, they asked, what was the secret of your success? And he said, well, first things first, you make a really good deal with Russia. And I don't know that maybe the deal with Russia is what everybody's waiting on, but certainly the idea that the first thing that you do to level set is that you understand the best thing you can do is make a good deal. And markets certainly respond to that. Obviously, there's perverse incentives and there's disconnects which do exist, but broadly speaking, a business environment doesn't want things like war or calamity happening. And so the more clarity or even just optimism that clarity will come that you can give to markets, the better that they do. And so everything else aside, that's my read on the market reaction. Obviously last week and some of these previous weeks have been pretty heavy on the sell side. And so it looks like with a bit more clarity or at least a vibe shift on the nature of the April 2nd tariff imposition, things do seem to be moving in a more positive direction. Now, speaking of a deal with Russia, there was meetings this weekend in, I want to say Doha, but it could have been in the Emirates, I'm not certain off the top of my head, where the Ukrainians and the Russians and the American negotiating teams were supposed to be meeting and figuring out a longer-term implementation of the ceasefire. Obviously, the energy infrastructure ceasefire readout of the American-Russian meetings last week doesn't seem to have really taken. I'm certain that the Americans are still trying to push to get people, namely the Ukrainian side, committed to their obligations under such a regime. But also, there's more to be struck and there's more going on than just these energy strikes, which, while important in the big picture, aren't super impactful in terms of the realities of the conflict. But what I think is very telling is that you saw the Ukrainian side leaving the meetings apparently rather early, looking very dissatisfied, certainly not looking to engage with anybody. When people leave a room angry and upset, it's usually a good sign that they're angry and upset. And I think big picture, the Ukrainians are having one hell of a come down from basically being in the catbird seat, driving the collective West, the NATO alliance, global financial markets in a way, right? Look at all of the resources which backed up behind Project Ukraine, especially in 2022, 2023, to keep it going with the conflict. And now to realize that their position is somewhat fatally undermined because it was always kind of, they were there because there was no strong center. Well, now you have a stronger center and a policy vision from at least the Americans, which is, if not guiding the Europeans, at least forcing them to develop their own coherent strategy, which is important, right? Because the Europeans forced into a corner. There are internal contradictions in the bloc that are difficult to resolve. Perhaps this gives them the motivation to resolve them. Perhaps this exacerbates underlying tensions and leads to other issues, right? Last week, the talk was all of this rearmament energy was doing ugly things to the German bond market, and it was scaring the hose, I think is the correct professional term on it. And certainly you've seen capital flights from European and Asian markets to America and some non-American but developing markets that have a bit more of stability as their calling card. Europe is in a tough position. A rearmament project brings out within the bloc different competitive visions of what countries provide to Europe, what the role of the European Union and European federalism really is. And also, realistically, right, an army that a European state or a European superstate creates is a lot more likely to be used on a European state, even one within the EU, than it would be in a war with Russia or some other regional rival, maybe Turkey, for the simple fact that there are these existing large alliances. And also, nobody's actually going to start a war with Russia with all of the nukes that they have. Arguments that nukes are not real aside, it's it sounds great, right? We're standing up to aggression. We don't care the threats that they bring. You know, we're here in defense of our values and our patrimony. But obviously, that's not the case, right? It's a globalist project. And the thing with these globalist projects is that if there's not something strong which unifies and provides a cohesive internal identity to it, then it's always the easiest way to bring them down is just to heighten the internal contradictions. And in Europe, you see that, right? The Spanish and the Italians don't think that Europe's threats lie in Eastern Europe. They think that they lie in the Middle East and North Africa. So they have no reason to buy into it, right? The Czechs and the Hungarians and the Serbians all feel pretty threatened by big EU, not nearly as much as they would feel threatened by Russia, right? Whereas the Baltic states and Poland see Russia as their number one geostrategic enemy, but also they're realistic, at least the Poles are, to understand that if the French or the Germans that if the French or the Germans or any other power block, right, whether it's local to Europe or outside of Europe, try to use them as a launching pad for a war with Russia, then they're going to get burned, just as Ukraine got burned by being that proxy, right? The proxy benefits in many ways, but also by being used as a vanguard, they take a much higher cost. And for Poland, a country who, as far as European countries go, is perhaps got the highest possible outcome right now, the best optimal trajectory that they're on. They do have a nationalism. They haven't been completely demographically destroyed by immigration. There are strong social institutions. The military is still a functioning part of civil society, right? There's all of these good trends. Now, in service to a pursuit of a nuclear war, who knows? Certainly, I don't think that the Tusk government or people like Radek Sikorski are on the side of the angels. But you've got to give credit to the Polish state for at least understanding that a hot war with Russia would set them back and not truly advance their security goals. Speaking of security goals and insane Eastern Europeans seeking to start a nuclear war, Canada, run by Bank of England President Mark Carney, is looking at snap elections. So this is really interesting. He's called them very quickly. I believe they're supposed to take place towards the end of April, so we're looking at about a month time horizon here. And I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to seize this moment of opportunity which exists in Canada for the Liberals. Right now, Paul Liver and the Conservatives aren't really right wing in any meaningful way. They're the Jeb Bush controlled opposition, but previously the expectation had been that when there was an election, the Conservatives would take power because everybody hated Justin Trudeau, which is reasonable because everyone hates Justin Trudeau. Now, with Trump with threatening tariffs and this resurgence and fake Reddit Canadian nationalism, you're seeing a surge where it's likely that the Liberals would win. I don't know that Carney would outright win re-election. I don't know if a figure like Wayne Gretzky, for example, might step in there and cause a bit of disruption. But certainly, it looks like Carney is trying to consolidate gains, give himself a mandate with which to operate. And he's been remarkably quiet, I will say. It seems pretty clear that his regime is busy negotiating tariffs with America and that it's not perhaps going very well for them. I don't want to read too much into the initial returns, but what I'm hearing sure sounds like Canada is going to be one of the primary, I would say victim, but the tariffs that will impact them to the extent that they will because they've been an abuser, right? So it's hard to call an abuser a victim. Certainly, though, they're looking at really heavy existential national questions. Now, tangential, but also central to this is the invitation that America supposedly received to potentially join the Commonwealth, as passed along to Trump by Sir Keir Starmer on behalf of His Royal Highness or whatever, George the however manyth. So, no, Charles the Third. Whoops, George the Seventh. We're going all the way, boys. Um, because I don't think it'll happen. I hope it doesn't happen. I have issues with the British monarchy. Obviously, we fought a couple wars to not be part of the Commonwealth, so it would be really disappointing. But that would be like the one way you could take Canada as America and not immediately start potentially a nuclear war with the UK, given that Canada, to the British strategic position, is pretty much non-negotiable. And despite the disconnect between the Labor government and 10 Downing Street and the MAGA people in the White House, it is interesting that the British, at least openly, are trying to be the most conciliatory towards the Americans after they got dumped on a little bit by Witkoff last week in his interview with Tucker, which is must listen to if you're interested in foreign policy, because I think, really he's speaking Trump's inner thoughts on these things to a much wider audience, and it is revelatory in a way, and also gives you an understanding for where these people are coming from. But the British, despite many cutting criticisms of them that he made, including that the only I think he basically said that British leaders after World War II only know how to lie, hot chip, twerk, and pretend to be Winston Churchill, which seemed really, cutting. But the British reaction has been incredibly muted because I think that they understand two things. One, America needs a friend in Europe, and it doesn't need to be the same sort of relationship that perhaps existed in the Bush administration or earlier, but that there is a very serious value in a strategic relationship still with America, but also that the interests which define a more expansivist Anglo foreign policy are still deeply in contradiction with the United States, and that in places like the Middle East, while the French might be more willing to confront American power, I think the British are pretty reluctant, right? They'll do it in Ukraine. They'll do it, and certainly in other places, but Ukraine seems to be their priority. The Russian project seems to be their priority, and messing around with the Middle East has really seemingly been left to the French, which in many ways helps resolve some of these outstanding Anglo-American tensions because they are kind of deeply tied to the Middle East situation, which of course the Middle East is spiraling too. You've had this breakdown of the ceasefire or resumption of hostilities. There's this larger thought to Trump foreign policy and Trump as a war president or Trump as a peacemaker, because Trump is often out there talking about wanting to be a peacemaker, but then also becoming the brutal American, right? He will bomb the shit out of you. He'll call up a terrorist leader and he'll, show him a picture of their house before he kills their whole family. He'll deport a bunch of, TREN Aragua nerds to El Salvadorian prisons where they can get free haircuts, right? And those are all pretty brutal things. But also on the backside, it really does seem like he's willing to let client states a little bit off the leash, right? He's gone back to at least a degree of support of Ukraine. He's backed Israel through the breakdown of the ceasefire, and he was oftentimes making threats. But I think that unlike his predecessors, Trump's end goal is not war, right? For the Biden administration, the end goal was conflict and chaos, because that's how they advanced their empire in degrees. For Trump, I think that the end goal is a business climate which is stable and peaceful to the degree that you can make a long-term investment and not get completely destroyed on interest rates, which is a way more reasonable long-term goal. I might disagree with it like a little bit philosophically, but that doesn't matter because at least you understand what they're doing. And so in these areas where there are seemingly escalations coming from the Trump camp, it still really strongly seems that there is this attempt to advance American national interests. And I'll bring it specifically in with Venezuela, where over the weekend there was this announcement that secondary sanctions would be, and maybe it was this morning, but Trump announced that he would be imposing secondary sanctions on any country that traded with Venezuela. Um, and that this issue with TREN Aragua was related to, specifically, he was saying that TREN Aragua was an instrument of Venezuelan government policy and a weapon that was used against the United States. Now, part of that's for a domestic audience because he needs to justify in the current lawfare situation, which I'll touch on in just a minute, very strong actions against the Aragua train gang. And we're just going to call them the train gang. I don't like to say tren in Spanish because it makes me think of tren like the steroid. And besides, who names your gang after a train? Like, what are we? We're the Latin Kings. We're like the gangster disciples. Who are you? We're the train gang, guys. We're named after a train. Oh, are you from a train? No, we're from a prison. Oh, okay. Like it's stupid. Anyway, so the push on Venezuela, especially with secondary sanctions, is interesting because Venezuela does produce a substantial amount of energy, and there's been a lot of American interest in getting energy deals through them. Now, it came out very recently, actually, that the Biden administration had secretly signed off on Chevron, which is the major, besides I think it's Total, major energy corporation with exposure to Venezuela, who had a lot of their stuff nationalized by Chavez and the Maduro people. I don't know. That I feel like that's got to be bad for Chevron. I haven't checked their stock price. I'm not a Chevron investor, but it feels tough. But at the same time, it looks like this is just the use of policy, right? And he's using policy instruments to increment in a way to move towards an objective as opposed to just creating a negative situation or a situation. We hate Maduro. Juan Guaido is the legitimate president. We're not going to accept him. And it just sits and it rots and it becomes this nasty problem. Like that's really clear that that's not the end goal that they want. Don't forget, Rubio, one of his first visits was to Venezuela. This has been an ongoing dialogue, and it's not just a dialogue from a position of strength or superiority. They've been really trying to engage with these people. But also, you got to remember, under Trump one, they definitely tried to stage a coup down there. Silvercore, anybody? So I suspect that big picture, the Trump people are very much against the idea of a larger war in Europe, very much against the idea of a larger war in the Middle East. And you got to imagine that they don't actually want to have like an open, like major war with trenches and artillery fights on the American continent, but that they would be okay with, at least in Latin America, the security situation getting a little bit less stable because they want to drive investment to America. They want to drive up the costs to invest in third world countries. So instability is not the worst thing in the world for them, but also that they very well might be willing to engage in special military operations against, Canada or Mexico or Panama or Greenland or Venezuela. And that the instability that that would drive would be a feature, right? Militarily, there's a lot of analysis going into, well, the Russian army is blooded. They've been forced because of the nature of the fighting and going up against NATO's best equipment and like special operations trained, whoever. Um, that they've really had to up their game. Electronic warfare, the employment of drones, the countering of drones, armor doctrine, infantry doctrine, communications and equipment for that. Like all of these things that when you're put into a position of you're in an existential conflict, figure it out, bud. And they're largely on the well, we figured it out side. If you look at America and you take away the patriotic lenses, we are not ready for that smoke. We would, if you said today, well, we've got to deploy the American military to go fight a trench war against Russia or China or whoever, maybe we'd do good, but there's a lot of things that indicate that we simply don't have the preparation for it because we haven't been constantly fighting an ugly war for the past few years. Usually that's not a problem, but when you're in a hostile situation where your enemies have been getting that kind of training, uh, certainly a thought comes to mind that, well, start your own special military operation then. Force that reform process to come to you because it has to, right? Before the special military operation, this is true of any military before a war usually. There's a huge amount of corruption, of graft, of unnecessary officers or officers that are concerned about things other than lethality and effectiveness, and they accumulate, right? Until you have situations where, like Britain, you have more admirals than you have ships in your navy. But then the war comes, and assuming that you're not wiped out in, the cleansing, loving fire of an atomic bomb in the first few minutes or days, you're in this situation where, okay, we've got to figure out how to fight. We have what we have. There's a process where we can bring more stuff online, where we can improve what we're doing, where we can get more things. But we've got to go with what we've got right now. And in that, it's very natural to see a lot of officers and leadership and systems even get forced out just because they're not fit for purpose. Sorry, buddy, it's nothing personal. We need somebody who's willing to charge that tree line. And you're not going to get everybody. And there's going to be a real combat evolution process of Halo combat evolution. But no, no, no. There's like an actual iterative process where bad leadership gets killed, gets reported, gets your soldiers killed, gets your equipment blown up, and then you go through and you review what's happened. And as wars go on, as systems evolve, well, right, that can get better or that can get worse. Um, Honestly, combat selection is one of the most fascinating topics out there, right? So the Wehrmacht, for example, the German Wehrmacht in World War II, they were all about elite units. And so you had these absolutely incredible, ideological, motivated, filled with like 6'4" Chad units, and they were great. But when you fight a war like that, those units get used up first, and all those guys get killed. And so they're not really there to train the follow-ons. And you have this selection process. The way that the Germans would do it is they'd look at every unit and then they'd pick the top looking, top seeming candidates from that unit to bring to the elite units. which overall, so it's a skimming process, and when you skim like that, you reduce the overall quality. Ukraine has suffered something very similar, right? These ideological units, these units with a decade of combat experience, those guys are all dead. Did they use that process to reform, to improve, to clean out the dead wood? I don't know, because it really does feel like, as sharp as that blade was, it was really dulled, especially in Kursk. You can't lose however many people they lost. 70,000 is what I'm hearing go around, but you can't lose that many, especially if you're top flight fighters and the ones that you'd previously been using as like a mobile fire brigade. And you put your elite reserves in, then they get smashed up. Now you're in the situation where you've already drained off elite reserves from the other things, but you no longer have an effective elite reserve. um, Interesting parallels between the German military and the Ukrainian military. But that's a question for another day. I did want to touch, while speaking of warfare, on the lawfare issue, because there's been some interesting updates on that. Uh, One of the major firms, um, the names escape me. I just read a really good piece on it that was from the New York Times the other day. Not that the New York Times writes good articles, but it was interesting to read, as somebody who hates everybody involved. But basically, I think it was the Weiss firm. Weiss. They all have these just a list of Jewish names as the ones running them, and Weiss is like the Jackie Robinson of law firms because they were the first law firm in New York to have both Jews and non-Jews working together as partners. Like, that's crazy, right? Can't have segregation, but certainly it was in place in the legal industry, still is. But the white shoe firms not being willing to work with conservative clients has been a huge issue. And so what had happened was that Trump had made an executive order, and this is not the only one of its kind, but he targeted them just like he targeted Perkins Coie and said, okay, these people can't have clearances. These people can't do government work. And as the government, we're going to look very tough at contracts that we employ and any potential links that these people might have with these law firms. And the reason why is because people like Mark Elias, and Vicky Newland, and the whole regime change color revolution clique that's downstream of Hillary Clinton and Obama, um, they've really been working through both Trump administrations to stop him with legal process in a very anti-democratic way, using partisan judges that had been placed into the judiciary for just this purpose, right? They've got nobody. Well, I mean, they have Congress, but they don't have the ability to stop anything in Congress. They don't have the White House. All they've got left is their people in the judiciary, and they have created a constitutional crisis, which the White House is leaning into and openly calling it as such. But they've created a constitutional crisis because they've impeded the attempts of the president to govern at every conceivable step. Now, where this goes according to the Constitution ought to be pretty clear, but unfortunately, we're not allowed to read the plain language of the Constitution because we have to have people in dresses interpret it for us, which is always a problem. So there's expedited requests for certiorari from the Supreme Court, which very well could lead to a ruling on this sort of thing soon. My understanding is that House Republicans are not going to wait on the Supreme Court, that they are planning to move forward with a couple of different bills attempting to rein in the judiciary. And that'll be good if they are able to do it, because you can't really impeach these judges. You need two-thirds of the Senate, which you're not going to get the Democrat votes to impeach these judges. But you could pass a bill reforming the judiciary very cleanly on a party line vote. And I think that that's what they'll have to do. Now, I don't know that judicial reform was necessarily at the top of their plates. I hope it was, because they really should have anticipated this coming. But you can do a lot to reform the lower courts simply because they're not in the Constitution. Now, personally, I'd love to get rid of judicial review entirely because I think it's unconstitutional. It's not in the Constitution either. Obviously, courts, having abrogated that power to themselves, are going to be not eager to give it up. So, that's a bit different of a fight. But this is the place to have it. Is you use Congress, you use the legislative process. The biggest issue that the Trump people have had so far, um, at least on the domestic policy side of things, is that they have not been able to date to codify any of their changes. All of this is done by the executive. All of this could be thrown out by a new executive if they lose power. Now, one hopes that there is a plan once they kind of get past the budget stuff, that they really do crank down and force everybody and they put everything together. I get why Trump wants one big, beautiful bill, right? If you force a party line vote on an omnibus bill for the priorities of the administration, then it's a very clear delineation of friend enemy. And you can almost redraw the parties on it, right? If you vote against this one bill, this only opportunity that you have, we're just straight up throwing you out of the party, dog. And Elon Musk is going to spend 30 million bucks to take your seat and give it to somebody who will vote for us the next time around. That's, I think, the messaging that they're getting on the Hill. And I think it's pretty effective as of right now. But with the thin margins that they have, and with deep seated interests who want to slow down the Trump administration and who oppose judicial review because these are intelligence agencies, both domestically and abroad, and these criminal networks, which have no issue with blackmailing judges and who use our very corrupt system, especially our corrupt judiciary, to maintain control and power. So they don't want to see that kind of change. And this is the sort of institutional opposition that we see at every possible level. Couple more points to touch on real quick. There's a lot of talk about pyramids and the structures potentially under the Khufu, Khanem, Giza pyramid structure. I've seen the scans; they look very interesting. It certainly does indicate that there's a need for further research. There's some really weird prophecies about that. I would encourage people to look into Edgar Casey, once known as the Sleeping Prophet, who very serious people seemingly took seriously. Although he's kind of relegated to that not so much anymore. And obviously, every prophet makes bad predictions. Um, Not that I'm calling him a prophet, but it is interesting we're seeing it pop up now. On the converse side of it, I don't know that there's enough data outside of it to say that this is not conclusively some kind of psyop or bad reading or malicious manipulation. Um, so it bears in mind to kind of keep an easy keel towards it. I will say that if there is something to it, it would explain the prioritization and the longevity and the strength of the American Egyptian relationship, and also how quiet it is. You never really hear it talked about how deeply influential America is in the Egyptian situation, but there's really not been a period in the past 3 or 4 decades where America was not basically the sole driving force in Egyptian politics outside of like very specific short-term interests. We give them a lot of money, we tell them how it's going to be, and we protect them from getting murdered by their own people. And if things go weird, then I guess we try to murder them with our own people. Shout out the homeboy Barack Hussein Obama. Um, a couple more real quick. The F-47, a lot of discussion. Canard Gang is back in. We're so back, guys. It's awesome. But obviously, there's discussions of it, and I don't think that they want to give out all of the details on it. I just wanted to mention it right after the pyramids because there is this theme, and I don't know that it's legitimate to just full on identify, but of this advancement of technology, which is happening really rapidly and it seems to be somewhat downstream of the political happenings. And you can't like specifically associate, but you see this rapid rise in AI. You see discussion of altered or buried history. All of a sudden, there's this recognition that white guys in America have been getting screwed for a really long time and in a really ugly way. Oh, and by the way, we've got this really advanced aerospace technology. It, it smells like the day after Roswell in here, which is fine, frankly, right? If we've got this stuff and we're just using it in secret, it does us no good. So here's a little hypothesis. This is not necessarily where I'm at, but just thinking about the idea that okay, Trump's got these backers, these supporters from the military industrial scientific complex, the Elon Musks, the Peter Thiels, the Paul Singers, who inorganically, maliciously, whatever, but they're there and they're pushing things in a way that most people say, hey, that's not a terrible idea, right? I think JD Vance put it pretty well the other day that most people don't really know about Moldbug or Curtis Yarvin and they don't know about his love of science pussy. But they would probably agree with a large amount of the points he gets to. Now, I don't know. I think that your average person would be repelled by some of it, but like the broader picture of we need to tear down the synagogue, we need to break these systems, we need to have a government that's accountable and not corrupt and responsive to people and that values the heritage patrimony of the citizens who made it, right? Like those are pretty unobjectionable things and I think that's the thrust of where the vice president was getting with it. But with all of these, there's always this like creeping dystopianism, right? Musk and his ventures have been largely backed by In-Q-Tel and the CIA, but he's perhaps the most utopian, right? He's dreaming of a dystopia on Mars, which is great because it's not here. He's doing these good things in terms of technology and companies and getting in the fight. But obviously, he's like the avatar for seemingly a whole bunch of tech that we've kind of had that we've needed to roll out commercially. And I guess good for him. Like that's a good job if you can get it, being made the richest man in the world. Um, Peter Thiel, perhaps less so. I don't want to be sued, but there's certainly some stories about him and young men in balconies, which are just wild. But he's claiming to be on the side of the angels, and it's a little difficult because you have the surveillance technology from Palantir, which is hand in glove with the CIA, that was used, for example, to track down all the January 6th people. Alex Karp, the CEO of it, has openly said that if the real right wing ever took power, he'd be dangled from a balcony pretty quickly, and he's not wrong about that. But they seem to kind of be acting as this front of the rollout from government or paragovernmental or black research world, and it gets rolled out, and vast fortunes are made and life goes on and the power structure shifts. And now the fact that you've got people like Singer and Musk and Teal ingratiating themselves deeply into the overt power structure, it does allow the government to take on some of these previous power structures like the democratic lawfare lawfare industrial complex, right? All these judges and lawyers and the litigation services sector. That was a big profit center. It still is a big profit center. It's still a big power center, but they've worked to find ways to minimize its actual salience to American politics, right? They have worked to limit the power, to isolate, and to destroy each of the opposition sectors. And it's been pretty successful so far. I was discussing on a previous recording the idea of this cult of counterintelligence and trying to find them, and having found the counterintelligence function to see that it's actually working almost directly for America's enemies, right? You had Peter Strzok, who is the head of FBI counterintelligence, and FBI is the premier counterintelligence agency in this country right now. And he was, texting with Lisa Page about how Donald Trump can't be president, how they have to stop him. And so one does wonder if there's not this counterintelligence side to the Trump movement, which I think is hinted at pretty broadly. A lot of people seem to be tracking on that. But what are they really doing? Because it's not just necessary. They aren't doing things like mass arresting corrupt people. At least not yet. I hope that they do. They're not taking a huge amount of specific individual actions or like we're going to go get this person or this group. But what they seem to really be doing is changing the way that the game is played, changing the roles, changing the Overton window of not so much the politically acceptable discourse, although that's certainly part of it, but changing the window of how loyal you're allowed to be to America and to its values, right? And perhaps the best example of it to bring this all home is I was absolutely shocked to see Bernie Sanders the other day talking about how important it is that Trump is cracking down on fentanyl and on illegal immigrants and these criminal gangs. Now, there's two parts of it, right? The Democrats recognize that without appealing to these issues, which have so captivated the populist right, they're just totally cooked in the long term because, like, they can't win the argument against it. But also, they have to be thinking, gosh, can we take these issues from him, right? Economic populism as a leftist issue was the bread and butter of Midwest populism for 100 years. It still could be, right? The idea of American factories and American steel and American workers, those can all be leftist ideas. The issue is that because unions became so powerful in the Democratic Alliance, that it all became in the context of high-paying union jobs and all that. And so it became very easy to like negotiate the unions and their workers and their actual interests out of it. And also, fun fact, the CIA has released a lot of records indicating that all of the major unions have basically just been operating as intelligence fronts. And this gets us to the big picture of the geopolitics of the world, the countries and the corporations and the people and the individuals that we described. These are not actors on their own. In many cases, they are downstream of like domestic American constituencies, right? The Ukraine example is really easy to point to, but it's true because the Ukrainian state has in many ways backwards captured our intelligence, right? Trump in his first term was first impeached on the testimony of Alexander Vindiman, a Ukrainian spy who's in Congress now, a Ukrainian officer in their military, an agent of their intelligence, and somebody who worked to penetrate our military and is now in our governing structure. You have this all over. There's a lot of Ukrainian influence, deep, deep, deep down not just in our media, not just in our corporate world and our defense sector, but in policy making circles. And for the first time, I think in my lifetime, there's really been this push to actually try to fix that counterintelligence problem. Because it's not just about the intelligence, it's about the decision making that's downstream of that. The decision making that Trump makes is sometimes erratic because he gets bad information. Now, sometimes it's because he makes bad decisions. But if your problem is that you can't govern because there's all of these foreign actors constantly pursuing their own agendas to your detriment, then your primary goal has to actually become a counterintelligence one, a counterespionage one. You've got to push out these foreign agents of influence, and that requires changing the rules of the game. That requires strategic patience. That requires strategic deception, and that requires being willing to accept a short-term loss for a long-term gain. So that's the bull case. The bear case, of course, is that these people are getting run. But you know what, Leno, I do want to end on a specifically positive note. Uh, Listening to Witkoff on the Tucker interview, I was blown away because he has a very realistic understanding of the state of the world, which is weird, right? Like it should be, oh yeah, duh, the guy's going around solving global crises. You know, he's a top real estate guy from New York. He knows the world. He knows it. He didn't. It doesn't seem like he did. I mean, he still doesn't know the name of all five oblasts that are like at issue in Ukraine off the top of his head. He's only had the portfolio a few weeks, but he's come into it and he was talking about how important it is when we're doing this stuff to level set. And what he means by that is going in and talking to people in groups that we've been treating as adversaries and saying, okay, let's just be straight up here. Let's be actually honest about what's going on, why we're doing things, what's been happening, how can we move forward. And so as somebody who doesn't want to have a war with Iran, for example, as much as there's war drums beating in that direction right now, it's easy to see that that's not the administration's long-term goal to have a war in Iran, namely because they want to, keep the price of oil low, but also because they really do want to make deals, and they think that they can make deals by acknowledging reality, which is just a shocking departure from past behavior of the White House. I think it was Karl Rove, maybe it was Dick Cheney, but he talked about, and it stuck in my head, this idea that maybe it was Donald Rumsfeld, that we create reality when we act, that America is so powerful that when the American government does stuff, when the American narrative shaping apparatus goes to work, it literally creates reality. Not so much in the perception is reality way, but in the making magic sense of we are the Wizard of Oz and we're going to tell you what it is. And if you don't like it, then you're going to live in a world which we will tell you and which everyone will tell you is not the real world, and it's going to be very uncomfortable for you. Now, the morality and the function of all that aside, to return to a reality-based system, it seems almost quaint, but that is huge, and that is moving the ball forward. And so the pragmatism about facts, the pragmatism about what's true and not true, and not necessarily buying into narratives because they're useful or popular or drive policy outcomes that seem good at the time, is a much, much more sustainable model. And so with that, I want to end on a hopeful note and wish you a wonderful rest of your week. Goodbye.